So we have Ryan here today with me. Ryan is an old brother of mine from a long time. It's like a couple of lifetimes ago, at least. New York City. Yeah, and me and Ryan, we have agreed to discussing our contrasting positions on the upcoming elections. And hopefully, I'm Ryan. I'm curious to hear what your intentions are, but I'll also I'll share that my intentions are to attempt to demonstrate a way where we reveal more of what is going on within us as much as possible. Notice where we are, coming at each other, and take a step back and reveal more of what is going on within us. So just a better way of talking politics, like discussing politics. That is my main intention. And we'll start with some check-ins. Like we'll just start with some what we are bringing into this conversational space, and then we'll just let the conversation flow organically. Address the prime sticking points that seem alive on this subject. How does that sound?
That sounds great. Can I ask a question about ground rules?
Sure. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So knowing you personally as a friend for many years now, is it okay to bring in any content about you as a person as they relate to your political views?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, yeah. Like I think it would be actually that really enlivens me. Like I really believe that it is a disservice to discuss politics without discussing self, and specifically discussing like wounding history, and it can get a little thorny sometimes when we find each other's wounds to kind of press down upon them to hurt each other subconsciously, unconsciously, so that our points win out. So it's thorny territory, but I also think it's just, especially in 2024 where we are at, it's just impossible to talk about who we support, what values we align with, without discussing who we are as people. And it lives in me as like a introspective, personal, spiritual journey. Like this is a part of it. So yes, that feels aligned with how I want to have these conversations. And also like slowness, spaciousness when we are entering those moments, instead of reacting. Like that is what I would request. And in moments where reactions happen, that's fine too. Like we'll just try and stick to a practice of coming back to slowness, mutual respect to whatever extent we can maintain that, kindness.
Perfect. I love it. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, I'll start with a short check-in. I am feeling wrecked, honestly. Like I'm on the verge of tears in some ways. Like I can feel my face puffed up, with like just the pressure of I think that was my cat. No. Hey. Yeah. That's okay. What? Yeah. I feel like just fatigued, like really stressed out, and close to tears in some ways. That feels like my internal state. And a little concerned that about our friendship and how it might be affected by this new revelation, because I have a story that you were not aware about this shift in my orientation till our call last Sunday, and it was quite a big surprise. So there's some like fears and concerns about losing the friendship that are alive in me.
Yeah, thanks. So my check-in is, I'm happy to be here. I feel that in accepting this, it felt a little spicy. Like just hearing progressives for Trump felt like a lot of things came up when I first learned that this was where you were coming, and like this is what you were, like the content you were bringing to the web. And at the same time, like I'm thirsty for honest conversations between people on different sides, like across the political spectrum, that ideally own what is true for the people and are also reflective and are good-willed and trying to integrate like various perspectives. So for me, like the challenge is part of why I'm here. If this were progressives for Harris, I could have less to say. So that's a lot for me. Another is that's the main thing, I suppose. And with respect to our friendship, I don't have the same concern. Like my sense is that so long as I feel connected to like a root impulse in each of us that like believes in like some form of goodness or healing, that like that will sustain us. So
Beautiful. Yeah, I like that phrasing of like so long as being connected to a root impulse in each of us, like there's something, the core of who we are, the seed of who we are, and being able to see that in myself and see that in relation to you, like that feels pretty like a concise way of framing what a meaningful friendship feels like. Yeah, lovely. So yeah, in terms of like the top subject that comes alive in me as I like feel into what would I want to discuss with you is abortion. Like that is like the main thing that comes up. It's not something I've addressed yet on the podcast. That was like the first thing that came up. Yeah, abortion. And I'm curious what you have alive in terms of themes or topics that you would like to discuss.
So that's a great one. I'm down to start there. Should we start there?
Yeah, let's start there.
Cool.
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, it's a thorny one for me, abortion, or it feels very complicated and very contracted. There's like a lot of fear of discussing it, and at the same time it feels really important. And I know for a fact that most people that I've spoken with, especially women that I've spoken with who are voting for Harris, that is the topic that like sticks out. There is this like angst that they carry about Roe v. Wade being struck down, and that is something that they put on Trump. Like they believe Trump did that, and there is a certain amount of what I would call misinformation that is being spread by the Harris campaign around Trump's stance on abortion. I think the Harris campaign talks about like federal bans on abortion, like Trump signing federal bans on abortion, and he has on multiple occasions like denied that. Like that's not something he's planning to do. But the broader, like if I were to orient myself, like, how do we handle abortion? Like, what do we do about it? Like, should it be legislated at the federal level? Should it be legislated at the state level? What emerges for me is this like awareness that the US specifically is a huge country. It's like a really, really big country with lots of diversity across the 50 states. And yes, I think especially the issue of abortion splits this country up, like in opinions. What should be done about it? Like, both sides have the whole pro-life versus pro-choice debate. To me, represents the tendencies of American marketing to only highlight the positives of what they're proposing and completely skip the shadow side of what is happening. You know, there is a shadow side to pro-life, there is a shadow side to pro-choice. And then you're just like stuck against each other because you're not acknowledging your own shadow sides. So from that perspective, where I haven't looked into the details of Roe v. Wade as much as I wish I knew, but where I've landed is that there is some, or I feel some alignment with Trump's assertion that this is a subject that should be left to the states, like the states decide, and the states are different communities, different groups of people, and they decide what is right for themselves. And there is a question mark, like there is a bigger question mark, you know, what if that means even in cases of like rape or incest, a state decides to, and I'm just going to pick a random name out. I have no idea how the state is currently oriented. Alabama decides to, like, even in cases of rape or incest, abortions are not allowed, or not just not allowed, but the support is so low that they become almost inaccessible. Then what do we do with that? So it seems like there needs to be some level of federal legislation, and then the state should have choice. And Trump's stance on allowing abortion for cases like rape, incest, I think he and where the life of the mother is at in threat, like that feels right at the federal level, and then allowing the states to decide specifics feels right to me. Yeah, and partly where I come from here is this felt sense that I have grown up in a country, India, where I have felt the insistence of like America in the 90s or 2000s of wanting to impose how they think freedom should be promoted on like the rest of the world. So there's that part of me which goes like, these fucking Americans, they always think they know what is better for the rest of the world, and then they try to impose it on the rest of the world. So part of my, like, I am connected to that part in me that carries this like, oh my God, these Americans have no fucking clue, and they're just like promoting their way of looking at freedom on the rest of the society without understanding the complexities of that society. And that part aligns with like, like these people, the liberal populists, not knowing what like believing a certain way is right for more conservative states, and then wanting to impose that upon conservative states. So I am connected to that angst in me. It's like angst, anger, frustration. I think I'll pause there. That's a lot of different points to share. I'm curious what is moving in you as you hear that.
Yeah. Well, the first point I'd make is that it seems to me that, one, I appreciate your ability to look at one group telling another group what to do. But in this case, like, the base I start from, I suppose, is like individual freedoms. And so the group telling another group what to do or not would be what we tell people who are pregnant who want abortions, basically. So it's not like, I can see your point of liberal America telling, rural America or something, whether or not what the law should be. But for me, that seems less relevant. What seems more relevant is the person who has the actual being growing inside of their belly, and then whether the state tells them what to do or not. So, I think this gets more complicated around definitions of personhood and when that begins, but kind of on its face, I think that's probably where the juicier territory resolves, and it's not really a conversation I'm interested in having, is when personhood begins. but kind of where I land in terms of people telling other people what to do. And your India analogy would be, the Indians would be the women who are pregnant, and the Americans would be the ones telling, their imperialist like slaves or whatever, like how things should be lived. So I start there. And, I will disclose like, complexity within me. I was raised Catholic, and I feel a cringe or shadow side around aborting babies, but I feel bigger cringes in two areas. Number one, I'm a psychotherapist, social worker. I worked at a hospital called Boston State Hospital, which was basically some of the poorest and most traumatized people in the world who were in an inpatient psych ward because of crimes committed. So they were either found not guilty by reason of insanity, or they were found incompetent to stand trial because of their mental health status. So I was there every day with these people, and we had full access to their records, their whole life full of like all government records. And so one population I'm sensitive to is particularly people who are under-resourced, like financially or socially, or who are struggling in their life. For me, I'm interested in them being able to have access to abortions because I'm interested in minimizing unnecessary suffering. I realize there's hubris in me trying to label unnecessary suffering, but being around a person who grew up with, in abject poverty and with parents who didn't want them, and watching the effects of that, as a therapist, what feels most right to me is their parents having the option of not bringing the baby to term if they feel they can't provide an environment that is healthy for the kid. And so I'd rather not take that option away from them. And so that lives in me strongly. And then, I want to name, I should have made off the bat, but like a big thing I'm sensitive to is our capacity as individuals to really honestly put ourselves in the shoes of other people. And so in this case, just, it's a cheesy argument, but I think one that really stands is how good are Vignesh and Ryan at putting ourselves in the shoes of someone who has a uterus and capacity to bring a baby to term, or has ever been pregnant, right? So I think that it's a little old school and silly in a way silly for men to be talking about this, who just, unless we're really good at doing that. And I would say for me, I don't feel really good at doing that. My wife is pregnant right now. And so for me to be, I'm really aware of the way in which her body feels so different than mine. We already have this big experience gap about all of her experiences of carrying something inside of her and how different that is for me. And I just, on a hormonal level, on a biological level, can't relate. So it almost feels like, you and me or you and I are like not the folks to be kind of centered in the discussion. It was like, how, if I could, make the litigation happen, I would just let the women litigate that like entirely. Like, makes sense for me to have the legislators split off to just the people voting who are able to have babies because I trust, because I think the impact is more strongly on them, from a career standpoint, from a biological standpoint, from an emotional standpoint. I think the women, are more impacted, especially early and around abortion. So those are some of my initial thoughts.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I feel aligned with you that I am aware of not having much of a felt sense of what it is to be a woman, period. Leave aside what it is to be like a pregnant woman, that just not having an embodied sense of what that is. And there is, I feel like there is so much in here to dive into. You spoke about like men talking about these subjects women litigating, like handing it off to women to like litigate and decide what the right path is. You spoke about like parents having the choice to abort if they feel like they can't raise their kids well, to prevent unnecessary suffering, like prevent kids from being like raised in households that are Ryan, are you typing?
Oh, yeah, I'll stop. I didn't realize.
Okay. Yeah, I think it would just be helpful to
Sure, of course.
connect it. And this feels like a pretty charged subject to be talking about. Distracted. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, and I'm also aware of like there are so many talking points on this subject that are on the airwaves that I'm in some. There's also a part of me that is concerned about getting too much into parroting these different talking points that I've heard or you've heard, and we just don't end up connecting with each other. So I'm a little wary of that. Yeah, I don't know where to start in response. I think, do you have a sense of what you would like what is your curiosity about?
Oh, I just feel like all my points stand, so we can move on to the next topic if you'd like. We can just resolve this one as a win for me. If you feel confused because your capacity to, I was going to be, ham it up with you a little bit and like kind of joust a little, but protect your assertion that you can take choice away from people who are the ones carrying the babies as someone who admits they don't relate to them. Then we can move to the next topic. I think the ball's really in your territory, right? Like I've spoken to what matters to me, in a way that I feel with.
I'm not in that. I mean, I heard some humor in what you just shared, and I also want to emphasize that I'm not in this space of like whether I win on this subject or you win on this subject. Like that's not the space that I'm in right now. And there is like different. Yeah, I'll start there. Like about men discussing this versus women discussing this. Like there is something. Like I've seen it as a very and you presented a very soft version of it, but from women I've heard much, from liberal women I've heard like much strongly phrased versions of that same idea of like men should not be talking about women's bodies or something, like, and it's like framed in like a consent framework, like men do not have the right to tell a woman what to do. Like that phrasing is something I've heard. And in the society that I want to create, like I want men and women together to be discussing all the important issues and coming to a mutual understanding of how we want to live together, what society we want to create. So that phrasing of like, oh, this is not our space to discuss things, or oh, women should be able to discuss these things, like that in a way like feels very patriarchal in me. Oh, like let the women make choices about the house, that like that distinction of like men should not be talking about this, women should not be, like all of those distinctions feel regressive for me. Like in my mind, we should absolutely be talking about this. We should absolutely be trying to connect more with
I'll stop you. I'll stop you because I think I've been misinterpreted. I never said men shouldn't be discussing this. My comment was just that it makes sense for it to start with women and for them to be centered. So I'm just aware of the fact that people talking about like situations which they can't relate to, which they have major barriers to relating to on a first person subjective basis, is like, you know, like something to note and realize and to be here with. So I feel almost like you're responding to a different person right now. I'm not saying men shouldn't be talking about abortion. What I'm saying is that, like, for me, the world is better, or the place that I want to create is that when we discuss like litigation on something, that people who are impacted most by, influenced by the litigation, like their voices are heard more because, you know, like, or even they lead on it, right? Like the voting example, I'm fine with that. I'm curious if you're fine, if we, you know, it's a shame we don't have more female litigators, maybe, but like if we, or other representatives, but if we just let only the women in you know, the House and Senate vote on bills, or only the women justices in the Supreme Court make decisions about like abortion, would that feel like a step forward to you, a step back, just a question mark?
Yeah, thanks for that, the pause and the clarification and the rerouting. I think generally I feel aligned with people who's are having some kind of an electoral or decision-making system that empowers people whose lives will be more impacted by that decision to have a greater voice, like a greater say. And on that note, I'll note that I did look up the Supreme Court justice split when Roe v. Wade was struck down, and I think it was like 2 women and 5 men or something like that. And that does feel inaccurate, like incorrect to me. Like and I don't even know how well connected those men were to their lack of like embodied awareness of what it is to be a woman or carry a pregnancy. Like that absence, I don't know how connected they were to that. So that piece I agree with. Yeah. And is there an assumption there, Ryan, for you that, like, I'm curious if you hold this idea that if the women were listened to, um, then of course abortion would be like freely accessible everywhere. Like, is that something you hold?
No, I don't hold the assumption. I think it's more likely, just from the women I've spoken with, and I imagine if we look at like voting trends, but I don't think it's, you know, there's plenty of women in the pro-life movement who are super vocal, carrying signs, like talking about their families. So yeah, yeah.
And in terms of whether we, legislate this at the federal level versus the state level, like, do you have thoughts on where this should be going? Like, that is one axis of, who should be given more of a voice, which I'll note that would require like a significant shift in how we legislate and how we like run democracy. Like, something deep has to change in order for, like, I'm down for that proposal. And I'll share you one point where I've been feeling like called to, like, oh yeah, like, or I've had a similar thought of like, why are you opining on this issue when it doesn't affect you? From where I relate to this idea, which is around access of what the left calls gender affirming surgeries to minors, and what I would call chemical experimentation and irreversible genital mutilation on minors. The access of that to kids and promoting those pathways in schools. When I hear someone who, in my perspective or from my awareness of them, has no intentions of having kids, and they're like living a lifestyle where they're not trying to create family, I'm like, why are you even opining on this? Like, you should not be allowed. Like, I'm like, I care about having kids. Like, I want to have a family. And so I have landed on this notion independently myself, where it's like, yeah, like, people whose lives are directly impacted by something like this should have a greater say on subjects, and it should not be left to everyone. And that's kind of where the childless cat lady's comment of JD Vance comes in, of like, with regards to family making, like policies that affect families, people who are not caring about families should not, like, why are they speaking about it? Like, what place are they speaking from? So I relate to that, and that would need a pretty significant shift in how policies are run. That would need a significant shift in how, like, the government works. And in some ways, when I'm leaning for Trump, I'm like voting for that massive shift in how government is run. And having said that, so I think I'd asked like a question before I went into this tangent, which I've like lost.
You did. You asked about federal versus state
Yeah,
legislation.
federal versus state. Like, where do you, how do you see or orient towards that? Like, how do you decide that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that comes up for me again is like the trickier part for me, which is like definition of personhood, because my general orientation is to default into liberty whenever possible, so long as it's not hurting someone else. And so the question is, when is it someone else, I guess? And if it's not, if the aborted fetus isn't a baby, then for me, it should be just allowed, because I want to privilege the, maximize the liberties of individuals wherever possible when they're not taken away from other people. And I view it as the person who's carrying the baby's choice. And so I would protect it at the federal level, like, or, like we've said before, like let the female or people who can have babies, folks, be the ones who are making decisions. But yeah, that's what feels most right to me. And yeah, and
have you looked into Roe v. Wade? Like, what is the, do you have a sense of what the summary of Roe v. Wade was? Like, what was it? What was it allowing, or what was it?
Not like a great one. Yeah, I'm not sure when the cutoffs were happening but it's basically allowing abortion all the way up until like late stage, very near or like just before birth, right? Like is what it allowed.
I see.
Yeah,
yeah, this is the, I mean, yes,
elective abortions.
Yeah, it gets, this is the tricky part of, supporting liberty of individuals, which you're right, the essence of it is this personhood conversation. And I wish, I deeply desire that the conversation on the left, which is in support of like liberty and choice of the individual, could wrap in the choice of the fetus to live, like could wrap that into the conversation somehow.
Mm-hmm. Or die if it wanted to, if it knew what was coming. There's an interesting, deeper philosophical question that some people, I have a close friend who had an abortion specifically because they believed it was not right to bring in another conscious being without their consent. And their feeling was that the being wasn't necessarily consenting to their own birth and existence.
Oh my God. Yeah, that like just gives me the creeps. Like, that's like my true inner response of like just wow. The level of the level of heady contortion that we've gotten into as a society around these ideas that then lead to these like significant choices that people are making. Yeah, it really like,
I don't think it has to be heady too. I think you can sort of have a more like, deep spiritual orientation to the question of, is it possible that bringing someone into the world is without their choice? That like I mean, as a therapist, I've talked with a client who says that their life is mostly suffering, that both of their parents had major, significant long-term mental health issues, and they, have been suicidal for much of their life and have really questioned why their parents would have had a baby, knowing that they both had significant mental health issues, struggles with addiction, etc. So their question was, the compassionate thing would have been for my parents to say, you know what, given how our lives have felt and our experiences have been, it doesn't make sense for us to have a baby. And they, had resentment that their parents had done that because they felt like their choice was to take their own life and have their suffering be relieved, or um, or continue forward because others wanted them to, selfishly wanted them to continue living, even though their life felt bad, like all the time. So, um, that's a sort of practical example.
Yeah, and yeah, when I hear that, it's like, what are the values that we want to uphold in our society at large? And what I hear underneath that is despair. Like that the value of what is being expressed is despair. And do we want to promote despair as a societal value, or do we want to promote hope as a societal value? Like that becomes like the bigger question for me. And especially legislation and the incentive structure of the state that we create, I have a personal value that it should uplift hope. Like hope should be the value that is presented forward and kind of consecrated in the societal structure that we create. And people do. Yeah, it feels important to state here that people have done tremendous things coming from shitty childhoods, like horrific childhoods. And if like the most developed country on the planet consecrates like this idea that, because you have a suffering childhood, you cannot like have a hopeful, beautiful life. Like people suffer much worse things in other parts of the world. If like America consecrates this notion of like, yeah, like why should we bring babies in because life is suffering, like that and that just really conflicts deeply with um a religious orientation I have. And it's not that I'm in this religion, but I feel connected to the Buddha, and like that is the nature of life. Like, life is suffering. That is like the essential truth. But from that place, if we consecrate ways of being that are upholding despair as a value, the society it creates just sounds horrific to me. Yeah, I would have, knowing what I have gone through as a child, which is consistent rape from the age of 4 years old to like 11 years old from multiple people, I would still want to be born. And the notion that my mom and dad could check in with my fetus and gauge the consent of whether I want to be born seems so like it lives in the impossible realm, and like prone to so much projection, prone to so much of their own despair projecting onto the baby. I just don't buy it at the moment. Like that, the feasibility of that is just like I'd have to speak to this human who felt into their baby's consent, and it's decided that actually the baby wasn't like. Consent has also become verbal consent in our society. Like consent and verbal consent have gotten like kind of entangled together, and then when you apply that lens to a non-verbal being, you're gonna assume that you're getting their consent, but it just seems so like ripe for projections of your own despair onto the being that is coming forth, that it feels weak to me, as a way of orientation and upholding despair.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you on the orientation towards hope versus despair, and I feel enlivened when you talk about people going through difficult things and hard childhoods and having and living really fulfilling and wonderful lives. And that's one of my goals for myself in this conversation, is to remember that we're talking about like real people with real experiences and not just ideas. And when you speak to people with difficult childhoods living fulfilling lives, that feels wonderful. I feel nourished by it. So we share on the hope versus despair thing. The friend who was talking about consent with the fetus, they didn't report feeling into whether or not the fetus consented. They had a very intense and strong relationship with the deep idea of whether or not people as a whole were choosing to come into the world, or whether other people were choosing to come into the world for them. Not just their baby, but just people in general. And for them, that was very deeply tied to an Orthodox religious tradition they were raised in, and whether or not God chooses for people or people choose for themselves, essentially. So they weren't making the claim that they could feel into the baby's consent pattern, and and that's pretty out there. And maybe in 50 or 100 years, will have more sense. I think that one of the things we can feel into now is whether or not the parents want the child. They can feel that while they're pregnant, basically. And then there's this question of, I have the generalized question is, do we feel better about, what I would love in the hope framework when you were speaking about religion is my gut says, let's find homes where the child is wanted, because me as a being, I would rather be born into a family that wants me than into a family that doesn't want me. And even in a way more personal way, I don't know if you have interest in answering this, but like when you spoke to your rape experiences over many years, whether if you could just choose now, if you would choose to have lived your life without that in it. Because I think the reason I ask the question is because in some ways, what we need to do is if we're gonna outlaw abortion, for example, or we're gonna allow states to outlaw abortion, then I think the responsible thing, or the thing that I feel great about, is having a socially acceptable way of people saying, you know what, I really don't feel prepared to have a baby, don't want a baby, like never did want a baby, whatever, right? And to say, can we find a way of, finding homes, loving homes, safe homes for people, for babies who aren't wanted by their parents? Because if you look at the suffering because for me, I feel better about terminating a fetus at 6 weeks or 2.5 months than I do about saying, you know what, like most likely this kid's gonna be in a home where their parents don't want them. And even if they can, have an amazing chance of becoming a human being who works through their stuff and has a really wonderful life, maybe they would still have done the same thing with starting from a family that loved them, or even felt better about their life, starting from a family that wanted them there.
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of gets into an even deeper layer of this conversation, which is that I want societal laws and systems to be set up to honor the law of karma, which I believe, and this gets quote unquote religious, but again, I'm not adhering to any religion when I say this. I'm adhering to like my own spiritual path and what I felt and observed, and one of the things, and this gets into woo-woo territory. It's difficult to not talk about this without getting into woo-woo territory, which is that one of the things one of the most significant pieces of evidence I have about one of my past lives is that I was a soldier in a Nazi concentration camp, and I was with the two men who raped me in this lifetime, both my grandfather and his friend. And we were all soldiers together, and they too were the heads of a gang of Nazi soldiers who were raping Jewish prisoners in the concentration camp. And there was a point where they invited me to rape someone, And that was like a critical decision point for the journey of my soul. Should I speak up about the horrors of what is happening, or should I join something that might give me momentary pleasure, get me approval of my colleagues, but tarnish my soul for eternity? And I chose to rape and join that group instead of speaking up and possibly dying in that moment. And then we were born together in this lifetime again, and both of them raped me. So that piece, like that is like the extent to which I have like an awareness of my soul's path. And like those who are very constrained by science and what is defined by science as what we know, this is way past that. This is like way past that. But from that sense, like this lives in me as my soul's journey. Like even the notion that babies, like a soul being born, would choose the good things, like of course a soul would choose to be born in a happy, healthy family, is naive from my perspective. It's a naive notion. Like no, souls are choosing the specific karmas that they're trying to alchemize so that they can like move further along the journey. And the specific like spiritual era that we are alive in has horror in it. And some souls are choosing horrific things, and by you or your wife or the state deciding to like abort those souls because, oh, they're gonna have a suffering childhood, we won't be able to provide like all you're doing is you're taking upon the karma of death, like the karma of killing, and preventing, and that soul is going to find some other entry point to live through what it needs to live through, which is a suffering childhood, which is a childhood in an addictive household, so that it may have the embodied experience that it then needs to alchemize in order to like get to the next level. So this is the frame I have around this subject. And this is not going to land if someone is very constrained by scientific knowing or scientific truths. And yet this is the frame I have, and I see that frame, that babies should only be born if they're born in like happy households, like very naive.
Yeah, fair. I mean, I think it's interesting. I feel different things listening to that. Like I feel empowered around what I hear as acceptance of like dark, horrific things as part of the natural order. And I hear like, a sort of warrior mentality of, we as living conscious beings sometimes elect to move through these difficult things because that's where our learning lies. And like, I'm not going to back down from it, but I'm going to own that this is a piece of my life. And I can appreciate that. And I think I also, amid that frame, maybe this just shows my own constraint, but feel that like, I guess for reasons maybe unknown to me or not fully explored to me, like my strong orientation, like consistently through my life in lots of different settings, is to work to minimize suffering. And like, and so, and I do that on a daily basis as part of my profession. It's like my orientation, and it feels fulfilling to me. So yes, to agreeing that it's naive to say that every baby is going to be born into a happy household, but also yes to the idea of alleviating unnecessary suffering where it seems possible. And I think that like a lot of the law is really just, that's its charter in some way, or at least like maybe a positive description of the law would be that, right? Would be like, to just damage another person. We try to prevent that when possible. So for me, I got excited about this rights view. I like this, I could see the supporters of Trump getting really excited about like, oh, what does a better version of adoption or something like that look like for parents who don't want kids, and for other parents who do want kids, who say, we want bigger families. It's like, well, do you want this kid? Because I think it makes sense for them to be in places they're wanted. There, you know,
But again, you felt that supporters of Trump would be excited about what?
about like a conversation about how to make loving homes for, you know, babies that are born to parents who don't feel ready to parent or don't feel interested in parenting, or, you know,
Yeah.
I can see a very like religious, like, I mean, this is my guess, you know, not being in that crew myself.
Yeah, I mean, supporters of Trump are very diverse, like very, very diverse. And sometimes there is this like assumption that supporters of Trump are white nationalist Christians. And that's not been my direct experience. I'm not a white nationalist Christian. So, you know, it's like there's a big diversity in that. Perhaps it wasn't there in 2016 as much visibly. Like right now, there is like a lot of diversity. And yeah, like, you know, yeah, the frame I wanted to offer you, Ryan, here is like, is it that minimize suffering is the pathway, or is it pathways for alchemizing suffering? Like which one fits better for you? Like, is it minimizing suffering, or is it alchemizing suffering? And I'll like add some difference that I see in it. In that minimize suffering orientation, one can get overtly restrictive to prevent experiences that could cause suffering. Like in the story of the Buddha's father knew that his son was going, like the astrologer had like predicted that his son was going to be like this mystic and, you know, leave and not become a prince. Like the Buddha's father was a king. So the Buddha's father created this like palace of pleasure that prevented his son from seeing like the suffering outside, and he was like trapped in this like persistent pleasure, like food and women and whatnot. So that is like a view of like, oh, how do we like, let's not look at the suffering, let's minimize suffering. And the alternate frame that I'm offering here is alchemizing suffering. It's like suffering is an inevitable aspect of being born in this human life, in this time and era that we are alive. And how do we create societal systems? And I see a role as someone who alchemizes suffering. You're not minimizing suffering. People are coming to you, or any therapist is alchemizing suffering, because people are coming to them because they've suffered a lot. They're suffering on a daily basis, and you're providing pathways of alchemy for that, not for like minimizing it.
I mean, what I mostly experience hearing that is just appreciation for the question. I mean, I think maybe this really speaks to my family and my religious early upbringings. I'm not Catholic now, but I was raised Catholic, and like much of the messaging I received early on and resonated with was poverty is unconscionable. People who are poor are brothers and sisters. You know, war is unconscionable. People who are being killed are our brothers and sisters. You know, greed is like a lack of understanding of like how we're all interconnected, right? And so the frame was minimizing. The frame was, we are responsible to witness when a person's on the side of the road saying, please, I need warmth, I'm suffering, to minimize that suffering. And I appreciate the different associations that come with alchemizing. They feel like valuable as I look at my own work myself, and like they point to the value of suffering in a different way. And kind of in a funny way, one thing that came up for me was like, in this frame you talk about with alchemizing suffering is like it gets closer to an acceptance for me of what I you know, when you talked about gender affirming care for people who want to change genders in their teens or whatever, right? Like where you talked about it as irreversible, like, you know, torturous, like change or something like that. Your alchemizing suffering lens actually brings me from a place where I was of, you know, more averse generally to giving people freedoms to make long-term hormonal changes before they're 18. I definitely support that after they're 18. Like, you want to do some hormones, do some hormones. And I haven't thought deeply about this, so don't take a strong position on it. But prior to 18, I have question marks around it for sure, because I feel a little bit like, look, like, let's let the prefrontal cortex develop a little more, give people a little more breathing room about identity before making decisions like this. That feels protective and loving to me. But when you go towards the alchemizing suffering perspective, I'm like, well, maybe we are warriors who are strong and can choose, who have our own karma, and who can choose the karma of at, you know, at 16, fuck you, you don't understand me. I actually am a woman, though I was assigned male at birth, and you're preventing me from alchemizing my own suffering and pleasure and pain and joy by taking away my right to have my puberty affected in the way that I want it to, so that I can be understood the way that I want. And in the alchemizing suffering frame, that feels more like, okay, like if you've sought deeply, you know, if you've like been on your journey and this is your karma, like, you know, you've listened to us and we've said, you know, this will be irreversible, right? And so like, well, then we are here to support you, love you on your journey. And we want you to express, you know, fully as the being that you are and understand yourself to be. And we want to get behind that and give you the hormones and meet you, look you directly in the eye with giant open hearts and celebrate the way in which your consciousness is expressing in this body at this time, you know, with balloons and fucking hugs and friends and etc.
Yeah, there's an interesting shift in your energy I'm noticing, Ryan, in this last share, and I want to just surface that there is an energetic shift and address the. Yeah, I'm curious if it's a really interesting conversation when you bring that lens to transitioning, and where I stand actually is more about disclosure. It's about like disclosure of the fullness of what is being presented as a pathway, instead of the in my mind very shadowy labeling of it as gender affirming, which does not capture the irreversibility. It does not capture the actual genital mutilationary aspect. Like it is a objectively, the procedure is a genital mutilationary procedure. Like you're numbing the human being, sure, but what you're doing to the genitals is you're mutilating them and crafting them into something else. But I would categorize it under genital mutilation. And that disclosure, like it is our responsibility as a society when we are presenting pathways to children to provide disclosure. You know, this is what you're doing. If you have a cock and if you go through this surgery right now, you will never have a cock again in the future. Like, have you thought about what do you like about your cock right now? Like, having that disclosure seems important, and that is absent, like in the way gender affirming care seems to be like marketed and those pathways seem to be presented. Like that seems very absent. The idea that these hormones do not do irreversible damage to humans is questionable. The science of it has not been like the science of this needs to go through at least a generation of humans, all the way through, like someone starting at 20 all the way through 80, to see like how it affects their life. So the science of it is not as rooted as the people who are on the side of it seem to claim. So at some level, and you know, this kind of brings it into that same domain of like, what if your 13-year-old Ryan like wants to have a relationship with a 33-year-old man? What are you gonna do? It's in that same territory. It's about like, at some, you could have, you know, it's like you could have this alchemizing suffering lens. And in some ways, the way I saw your response was like you took this one aspect of a value that I'm presenting and presented, like took it to other spaces without acknowledging the possibility of like competing values. Like there are different values at place that a system of laws and incentives need to take into account. Yeah, like I the alchemizing suffering value does not stand on its own. Like it is it is a reframe for the minimized suffering value, but it has competing other values that need to be accounted for to create a holistic system that creates a good world, whatever that means, and that's like circular in a sense, because it's like I'm attempting to present my values, but my values are not limited to alchemize suffering over minimize suffering, and then everything else is determined by that one value. Like, that's what I would say in response.
Yeah, fair. I'm curious if you want to describe how you saw my energy shift in answering.
There was like
or what the shift was like what it was from and to or something.
It went progressively into oh, you want to talk about alchemized suffering? How about this is the, I'm going to take it to like an edge case and show how that is like ridiculous to you or something. And I was like, that is, one aspect of the value that I'm presenting on that axis of minimize suffering to alchemize suffering. And there are other values that would safeguard.
It's interesting because that's the perspective you just presented isn't how it lives in me, like as I presented it. Like this wasn't a na you're ideal. It was just an honest like statement about me being a person who's lived for a long time in the minimizing suffering frame of mind, noticing what it feels like to take an alchemizing suffering lens a little bit on this call for the first time, and notice this acceptance of or willingness to support things that might integrate suffering more potently than they normally do. So if a person were to say, I'm going to do this, and it might have, the suffering consequences might be 100x what a lot of my other decisions might be, because this is my body and it's irreversible, and someone might label it mutilation, right? Like this wasn't me trying to poke a hole in your argument. This was me reflecting like what my consciousness feels like taking on this lens and thinking about this. And I think one of the things as this shakes out for me is I think one of the places we agree, it sounds like, at least implicitly, is that like, I mean, for me, the theme of this whole discussion we've had so far is, when can we make decisions for others or limit their decision making? And it seems like one of the places you and I agree, I would imagine, is when we are adults and the people we are choosing to limit the decisions of are children. When you talked about, can this 15-year-old sleep with this 30-year-old? I think like, right now the social context says no. Like, are there situations in which that might be a wonderful idea? Maybe, I think. Are there situations in which that might be a horrible idea? Yeah, almost fucking certainly.
Yeah.
So can there be nuance there? Where's the parent coming from? Where's the child coming from? Where's the 40-year-old who wants to sleep with the child coming from? All to be considered like with thoughtfulness and examined. And I think that those examinations teach us about our values, our karma, what we believe in, right? But no, as you framed it with I think they do fit in the same category for me of, would you let your 13-year-old sleep with a 40-year-old, and would you let your 13-year-old take hormones to do puberty blockers or something, right? Like, in that it's an adult who is ideally protective and supportive and trying to help their child, trying to lend wisdom as someone who's been around longer to what they feel like is most likely to lead to outcomes that are good for the child. And that being a conversation, and in some cases, a one-sided decision-making process. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with a parent pulling a 3-year-old back from the curb as they're about to cross a busy intersection. That's okay. So, and we should wrap it up. And I don't know how you like to end these, but I have an obligation.
Well, it's just, I was also noticing the time, and it's just been a pretty rich conversation with you on this. I haven't had many. I think this is the first interview I'm doing with someone who's going to be voting for Harris in this election. So there is no formality to ending it. I'm appreciative of the conversation that we had. If there's any closing thoughts you want to share, welcome to do that.
What feels best for me would be if you feel you learned anything about yourself in this conversation, what
Beautiful.
you'd point to.
Yeah, I like that. Let's see. Yeah, my main takeaway is that notion of somehow having a policy making system that weighs in who the policy is going to affect more so than, than others. Like that, there is something to that idea that feels very resonant with me as, an immigrant in this country, and as someone who wants to create a school system that is not, or wants my children to be in a school system that does not open them up to horrific, irreversible pathways, and that be determined by people who are not having kids. So I agree and resonate with that. And there is an awareness, and I've had this awareness, and I want to continue connecting with women who have gone through abortion themselves and really feel what they have experienced. So that felt very alive, as you were talking about your experiences. And I feel inspired to continue on my pathway to be an IFS therapist, because just hearing you speak to your direct experiences working with people who are suffering, like I feel in your energy a certain felt sense of what it is to be with a human who's suffering, that I want to incorporate into my orientation around the world. That feels helpful.
Beautiful, beautiful. Maybe I'll see if I say all three of these things. One, the minimizing suffering versus alchemizing suffering for me felt like a shift that's helpful, and like I mentioned, applies to my work, and I think will taught me something about the frame I come from. It was interesting to try on a different lens that kind of feels in some ways stronger or more warrior-like in terms of how to respond to suffering and how to view it as karma, which I feel from you. Like I'm taking in a piece of your experience that feels valuable to me. Two, I also, one of the great benefits of being a therapist is these clicking moments I have where I fucking understand more about what it's like to be someone who's had a different experience than me, where it's fucking feels so valuable. Like I've been working with people with ADHD a lot, and one person finally got through my thick skull. I've read books on ADHD, right? Like Gabor Mate's Scattered Minds, and I'm like, oh, I kind of understand, but I don't feel like I have it. And then one person says, my whole childhood, it's been so difficult. I was so good at school, but it was so difficult to do basic tasks like clean my room or fold my clothes was so difficult for me. Like I would switch to the next task or avoid it, or it's this big block I had. And every adult, my parents were saying, basically, you're lazy, you don't care, you're lazy, you don't care. And they were like, that's not my experience. I did care and did have energy, but couldn't do it, even though I could write papers and finish homework assignments and have the right answer in class. It was like this long-term persistent obstacle that someone didn't understand. So they're basically saying, I have this, almost like a handicap that you can't see. And in session, finally, after trusting this person enough on everything else, I'm like, oh, this is actually just very hard for them. It's like a calculus problem someone who is bad at math can't solve, And their parent sort of rejects them in a say, because they hate the feeling of my kid can't do this basic thing, right? So for me, the clicking of it's still hard for them as an adult. They can't remember, or if they make a system for reminders, it still doesn't totally work. The lesson for me is to trust them. They're not lazy, and it's not that they don't care. There's something else happening here that puts the barrier there. And so part of the beauty of being a therapist, and part of the value, I think, of being a politician, is to be able to take first person subjective experience of others on and say, oh shit, Here's
Mm.
what it's like to have it growing inside me, the baby, or to be like, shit, well, will I have someone there by my side for breastfeeding and changing diapers? And like, can I blah, blah, blah? Like, that's important. And when you spoke to which Supreme Court justices really have this felt sense of, kind of the reality of not the intellectualization, but the reality of the influence of decisions on real people with real experiences, I would say that there's value in the people who make decisions who are voting in to be able to simulate or feel into or embody other people's experiences. So that's, I guess, what's alive for me as we wrap this up.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, there's something really beautiful in that last piece that you shared. I felt you come really alive there, and there's so much to share in response to that as it pertains to this election. But I'll honor the closure of this conversation here, and trust we'll have more space to connect, either in the context of elections or hopefully even not, something else, and share more of these perspectives with each other. Cool. Thank you, Ryan, for hopping on. Enjoy
Love you, brother. Thanks so much, Vignesh.
With your parents, and I'm happy to hear that you two are pregnant. I did not know that, so congrats.
Yeah, I'll drop a bomb in that podcast.
This is your public announcement. Take care.
We're gonna keep the baby.
Bye,
Vignesh.
happy. Yeah. Bye-bye.